For the palette today, we will be using titanium white, flake white, burnt umber, alizarin permanent, cadmium red medium, yellow ochre, sap green, ultramarine blue, and ivory black. And if you're new to this channel and you want to know exactly what materials I'm using, you can go ahead and scroll down to the description box below and it'll all be typed up for you. So I'm starting off with a very basic flesh tone mixture. So today is the first color pass. So what I have on the side is Liquin Original. So I'm using Liquin Original as my painting medium of choice just to increase the fluidity of the paint. So I'm just going to create a very basic flesh tone. And again, today I'm working from life. So thankfully the footage from today's portrait painting session with my art group, thankfully the footage didn't go poorly like it did last time. So anyway, so I'm mixing up a very simple flesh tone combination. It is a very simple combination of cadmium red medium, yellow ochre, flake white, and burnt umber primarily. So I'm using a very kind of a quiet flesh tone, a muted or subdued flesh tone. And I'm thinking about the local flesh tone, the average flesh tone, and that's what I'm mixing up. Just very simple gradations of flesh tone. Now on the bottom I'm going to do something a little bit different. So I'm going to use a red value scale just to apply some heat to the colors, and then I'm going to after that I'm going to mix up a cool value scale. So the mid-range of the warm value scale consists of a combination of the flake white, alizarin permanent, cadmium red medium, and then as it gets lighter I will use more of the cadmium red medium. So now I'm using just ivory black and ultramarine blue for the cool value scale. So this is going to be so I can quickly move back and forth between color temperatures. So it's pretty much just ultramarine blue and ivory black and the titanium white for the cool value scale. And so I have just those three value scales. One will be for the flesh tone. After that I really won't be mixing much. I will be taking right from the palette. And so the goal of the first color pass, is not to try to get the exact color right away. The goal of the first color pass is to further develop the drawing and the forms with this new tool that we have, which is going to be the hue, the chroma. So I'm starting off on the forehead, just trying to observe a very simple plane. Now I'm working from life, so I will insert the photo reference that I've been using earlier, but just note that the color is going to appear a little bit different on the painting than the photo reference. So what I'm doing is I'm going to put a little bit more of an orange, kind of orangey tint to the flesh tones. So today in the studio with my art group, the colors appear a little bit warmer, actually a lot bit warmer when working from life. And the light fixture that I'm using to illuminate the model has a kind of a variable temperature setting. So I have the temperature set at the same how do I express it? I have the lighting adjusted to the same temperature for each sitting. Now the only thing that will really change the lighting on the model when working from life is the light outside, so the window lights, which are actually kind of a nuisance. So the daylight is not really a good thing when you're trying to have a consistent light with the model. So what we're doing right now is we're observing very simple gradations of tone. So we're going to continue to further develop the structure with very simple shapes. So simple shapes of light and dark. Basically light halftones, darker halftones, and that's pretty much it. So again, the temperature is going to look a little bit different with today's lighting scenario, and I think that I personally like pushing the flesh tones a little bit warmer than the way they appear in the photo reference. Another thing that I'm noticing about the photo reference is that it also kind of washes out the values. So when I'm observing him from life, I see much more depth in the forms than in the photograph. So that's really what I'm going to try to go after today. And what we have here is a very simple form overlap. So we have overlappings of form on the forehead. So at areas that are darker, such as this area right here, because the plane is facing away from the light, and that's about it. And I'm trying to maintain a single unified color and just change the hue of that color, just like you saw me mix in the beginning. I'm very much just taking from the palette and recharging it when I have to. But what I'm trying to do is just maintain the hue variation to a minimum. We actually don't have that many different colors on us, depending on the lighting situations and all of that. Typically, there aren't really that many hue changes, but we will put in some hue changes in the later stages, and we will experiment a little bit with the color in the later stages. But again, the first color pass really is about introducing color with the value and drawing in mind, because at least for me, I feel like the superposition of color on top of a monochromatic underpainting, I feel like just gives my mind like another I don't know, another perspective to look at the values and the forms. So with the forehead, we're taking our time. So I'm just taking my time with each little shape on the forehead. Now I'm not going to spend the entire pose on just the forehead. So I'm going to want to move around across the entire face. Now, another interesting thing to talk about when working from life is the variations in the pose. So the biggest question I've seen asked about artists that like to work from life, such as me, is what do you do when there's a variation in the pose? Well, first of all, the easiest solution is just correct it. Ask them to turn their head a little bit towards you, away from you, and all of that. But now, another interesting thing about this approach, this process that we have for approaching this painting. At this stage in the painting, I will most likely not move anything. I probably won't move an eye or a nose or anything like that. Now, it's not always the case. But when working from life, you really have to think about the timing, because let's face it, we have to pay model fees. It's very rare that we get someone to sit for us for free. So that's why I have this portrait painting group, that I run on Tuesday mornings. So we all, well, basically the school pays the model fee. We pay a fee to the school to allow us to paint from the model. That's just the way that goes. And there are plenty of art schools like that have open studios. But anyway, so the thing is, you want to be mindful of your timing, especially if you're working from a live model. So I will not be chasing the pose. If there are any variations in the pose, I'm not going to chase them. I already solved the problem of drawing and perspective. So I have the portrait placed, I have the features placed, and I'm not moving anything when I'm working with the live model. Now when I return home to the studio, and if I see that I want to move something around, that's easy to do. But in any case, now returning back to the actual painting. So we're starting to put in the temporal region of the skull. That side plane that you're seeing on the photograph, there's actually quite a bit more depth to it from life. So when working from the live model, you'll also notice that there's just that the values are much darker, much more crisp and clear. So that's what we're trying to record here with the side plane of the forehead as we approach the temporal region of the skull. And now we're just putting in some more little dark shapes. And I'm thinking that the color is also a little bit warmer in general near the temporal region of the skull, so it does have a smidgen more of the cadmium red, flake white, and cadmium red, medium, flake white, alizarin permanent are going to be a staple for these darker tones. Now, I like to think of the idea of building on top of the underpainting and not painting over the underpainting. So I'm building onto the monochromatic structure that we already established. So now there are many more plane changes that we can observe with the introduction of the color. So for instance, on the side plane right there, we're actually putting in a much more delicate transition of value across the frontal sweep of the skull. And now we're kind of relating the side of the skull to the corner of the concavity of the eye socket. That was that brush stroke that we're actually applying right now. So that is the dark for the concavity of the eye socket as it rolls towards the glabella, which is basically the middle between the two eye sockets. So now we're starting to place in the plane for the glabella. And just on a practical note, depending on how you're feeling that day, if you're feeling really ambitious, it's kind of fun to just start off with something like an eye. Typically, I will say when reworking a painting, especially with the first color pass, I think it's a little bit easier to start off with the forehead and then manage the planes as you move down towards the eye sockets. And then you conclude the forehead with the glabella, the plane of the glabella, as it then starts to kind of taper into the nasal bone. So that's pretty much going to be the large value arrangement for the forehead. See how very quickly we can establish those forms. Now another thing, I don't know if I mentioned it already, but since I am running this portrait group, we have a timer for the model. So the model poses for us, so Steve poses for us 20 minutes at a time. So I just use my phone and just place a timer for 20 minutes. So again, just having that type of patience really goes a long way. So what I mean is the first 20 minutes I was really focusing with the forehead, and if I felt like I had done what I needed to do, I did not move to any other areas. So around this stage of the painting, I'm approaching the model break. So I know that the tendency for me would be to continue to move on to the other areas, but I'm holding back and placing in more values for the forehead. And to be honest, I think that the forehead is actually this is probably one of the better foreheads that I've ever painted. And I think that just has to do with the fact that I'm there working from life, to be honest. So now we're going to mix up a little bit of a middle tone that's less warm. So to cool down the heat of those warmer colors, I'm using sap green in this middle tone region of the palette. So we want a warm color, but we don't want it to be too hot. And this little gradation of value that we have here, this little tiny window of value on the palette, that's pretty much the area of value that we're going to stick to with this eye socket. So now we're painting in a darker, warmer shape for the concavity of the eye socket. Remember that plane is facing the light a little bit less. So just like I said on the palette, we're going to stick to that value range, very compressed, very subtle, yet darker than the forehead. And remember, I did paint a portrait sketch or a portrait study last week. So last week's video, the one where the footage didn't quite work out how I wanted it to, that was a really good practice run, trial run for this painting. So when you do a portrait study before painting a larger painting like we did with this one, we learn where the troublesome areas may be. That is, with the portrait sketch that I did last week, this is precisely the area that I struggled with. And I knew why I struggled with it only after painting it. So I struggled with this shape here on the side of the concavity of the eye socket in the portrait study because I was flattening out the value. I was making the value on the concavity of the eye socket too similar to the value on the forehead. And those planes are in different angles with respect to the light source. So they should have different value arrangements. So in any case, in the portrait sketch that we did earlier, I did struggle with this area, so I knew exactly what to watch out for in this portion of the painting in particular. So now we're putting in just a little bit of a light shape there for the tear duct. There's a very distinct plane change between the side plane of the nose, the side of the nasal bone, as it tapers towards the eye socket. It creates a very interesting high lit region right about there, and then tapers away from the light, turning away from the light. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add a little more clarity to the edges. So we're going to look at the edge between the concavity of the eye socket and compare that edge to the high lit region of the tear duct. So the edge for the concavity of the eye socket is much softer than that of the edge for the plane subdividing the form of the tear duct. And now, speaking of edge, we're going to put another gradation of tone on the eyelid itself. So the eyelid is going to be a very fast curve, meaning it's turning away from the light at a much faster rate, meaning that the curve of the eyelid is basically more curvy than the curve of the forehead. For lack of better terms, it's just more of a curve, meaning that the gradation of value for the eyelid itself is going to turn away faster. Now that we're moving on to the side plane of the eye socket, we're now encountering another area where I struggled in the portrait study that we did for this painting. So the separate portrait study that we did for this painting, if you missed that video, it's okay. The separate portrait study that we did for this, I think that was uploaded, it was uploaded last Wednesday, I think. Yeah, it was uploaded last Wednesday. So if you missed that, there's going to be a video for that. But this is another area where I struggled in the study. So I was over darkening this plane directly beneath the lower eyelid in the portrait study. So in this painting, I knew not to make that value too dark. That plane is very, very similar to the plane of the basically kind of like the temporal region of the skull, the side of the skull. Just meaning that that value just isn't as dark as I once thought that it was. And now we're going to move into the side of the eye socket, and we're going to put in a few form overlaps and just a few touches of value. You'd be surprised how much a few brushstrokes can influence the form. So for instance, now we're putting in a lighter plane and we're contrasting it with a darker plane, just like we're observing in nature. So now what you're starting to see is just very basic form overlaps around the side of the, I don't know what to call it, the squint, the line that is created when you squint at something. Not really sure the fancy anatomical term, but I will tell you that that's the side of the zygomatic bone, the cheekbone. So the side of the eye socket tapers inwards towards that area that we just painted there, and that is the top plane. So right about there, that is kind of the upper region of the cheekbone, the zygomatic bone. And that shape right there is precisely along the frontal sweep of the skull, imagining a little band around the skull. And now we're going to just move on to this little plane here. So this plane is a little bit lighter. So within each major plane, we're subdividing those major planes into smaller forms, just making sure, however, that those smaller shapes fit within the larger picture. And now we're going to push this little dark shape with it's a little bit of burnt umber, sap green, and yellow ochre, and probably a touch of flake white. So now what we're doing is we're trying to create a plane change directly beneath a smaller plane change that we had already established. So these are really going to be very tiny shapes now. And it's surprising how fast this can take form. Basically, just look for the planes and how they relate to one another, and that's it. So there's going to be a little bit of a lighter plane, kind of like a passage between one plane and another plane. We want to make sure not to flatten everything out. These planes should kind of connect with one another in some way. And now we're going to move on across the side from that plane that we were painting as we approach the high lit regions of the cheekbone, so right around here. And remember, I'm trying to keep the hue changes to a minimal. So I showed you how I mixed those flesh tones in the beginning of this video because I really don't want to focus too much on color mixing. It takes a lot of time to mix up a color just to find out that it's the wrong color. So rather, I'm keeping the colors very, very simple and emphasizing the tonality of the picture. And again, with the first color pass, that's precisely what we want to do. As the layers develop, we can easily change any certain shape of color that we want. It's much easier to work that way, in my opinion. It's a little bit lighter around here as that plane is facing the light a little bit more. And then of course it's going to get darker as the planes turn away across the side of the cheekbone. So right around here, we're going to have a pretty predominant plane change. And just look how that one plane, that just one dark shape, all of a sudden gave more form and volume to the forehead. Now the forehead is starting to look even more realistic, naturalistic, trying to paint what we see, interpreting visual information. So it's a little bit darker still. And we're kind of putting in an even lighter plane. And keeping the edges rather soft around the cheekbone. And a little bit sharper near the temporal region of the skull, side plane of the forehead, essentially. So after working out the major planes for the cheekbone and the eye sockets, I think that now we're going to use the little value scale that we mixed up. So I'm taking from the the cooler values, and a little bit from the hot values that we mixed up, the warmer values, and we're going to adjust the little corner of the side of the nose. So now that we're working down towards the bulb of the nose and the wing of the nose, we're going to take a look at the edge between this shape here. So again, I'm trying to maintain the color that we mixed up, and the reason that I was bouncing back and forth between those that pre-mixed warm value scale and cool value scale is just to kind of maintain the balance between the warm colors and the cool colors. And basically it's the same type of color mixtures that you saw me create in the beginning. So now I'm creating kind of a bridge or a pathway between the maxilla region of the skull and the side plane of the nose. So that is that little shape that we painted in right there. So that little shape was to facilitate basically the transition from one plane into another plane. And again, we're really trying to sculpt out each one of these planes. And the other eye socket was very, very similar. So it was painted in a very similar fashion. So I didn't really feel the need to show the development of that eye, since it was essentially the same thing that I did for the eye to the left of your screen. So now what we're going to do is move on to a different form momentarily. So again, I'm just kind of putting in a darker shape for the eyebrow. But in any case, now we're going to move on to some different forms. So we're going to look at the side of the little corner. It's almost like the little window of the other side of the face. So the face is in 3/4 view, but extremely close to profile. So there's only a little tiny bit of light that we're seeing in there. So in any case, for the bulb of the nose, we're going to treat it kind of like a cylinder, almost like a cylinder. So first we're putting in these darker planes that are facing the light a little bit less. And we're going to work our way up the value scale. So it's going to be darker near the kind of the junction between the bulb of the nose and the wing of the nose. So now we're painting in a little band of color and letting the transparency of the paint show through a little bit. So that means we do see the highlight from the underpainting. We can still see the highlight from the underpainting influencing the values that we're placing in. So we're just going to cover the bulb of the nose a little bit darker than need be, so that we can go over it with something lighter to create a transition or a gradation of form. The bulb of the nose is also a fast curve. It's a much faster curve than the eyelid, and the bulb of the nose, excuse me, the bulb of the nose may be the fastest curve, I think, next to the wing of the nose. So notice how very rapidly the values are changing on the nose itself, on the bulb of the nose. Very, very fast transition of value. Whereas you look at another area, say the top plane of the nose, and that's a very slow curve, super quiet curve, almost flat, almost completely flat. Now we're just going to add in a little bit more light here just to create a more smooth gradation of tone for the curvature. And now we're going to do the same kind of thing to the wing of the nose. So the wing of the nose is going to be a little bit darker. So we're merging from the dark. So we put in the dark light first. Remember, the dark light is the light as light transitions into shadow. So as the light gets closer and closer to shadow right there, that little edge right there, it's a very important value when it comes to rendering out the form. As long as you have a very descriptive gradation from light into shadow, you will have a very convincing image. So the curvature of the wing of the nose is a little bit less than that of the bulb of the nose, but yet it's still a fairly fast curve. So the way that we're distributing the values for the wing of the nose is such that it is a much faster curve than the, say, the forehead, but it is a slower curve than the bulb of the nose. And so we're painting in some kind of I'd say transitioning planes, or planes that are unifying one plane into another plane. You could also kind of think of it as a bridge. So that plane we painted in was kind of the bridge between the wing of the nose and the bulb of the nose, but that plane still has to maintain its relative tonality to, say, the entire value range for the side plane of the nose. Meaning, just trying to make sure that the values that are in the darker regions of the nose remain darker. That's it. And now we're going to move on to a different plane. So we're going to look at the cheekbone, well, beneath the cheekbone. So right around here, we're following the side plane of the zygomatic bone, but it also wraps in and tapers towards the maxilla region of the skull. So the maxilla region of the face is right here, precisely where my brush is. It is kind of the bone that is resting near the nasal bone, and it's kind of sandwiched between the zygomatic bone and the nasal bone, I think. But again, I'm not an anatomist, so don't quote me on any anatomical stuff. I know that the cheekbone is called zygomatic bone, and that's pretty much the most confident I can be when it comes to anatomical terms. But in any case, we did throw in a tiny bit more of the cadmium red medium into that flesh tone mixture around the cheek. So the cheeks right around here. So this little shape here is going to be a little bit pinker. There's going to be a little more blood flow in this area. So it's going to be a little bit more red. And again, the color is super simple to mix. It's the same thing you saw me mix in the beginning of this video, with just a touch more cadmium red medium. And that's it. The color is not the difficult thing. The value and the structure is the difficult thing. So that's what we're working on and continuing to develop. So for instance, this plane right here is facing the light a little bit more than we had described before. And I noticed, working from life, I noticed that that edge is actually a little bit sharper than I noticed in the photo reference. Not sure why that was, but in any case, we're starting to put in that lightmost facing plane, and really it's about how you describe the darks. So let's go and throw in this kind of like a Rembrandt touch of a warm single warm brush stroke on the side of the nose. So that's a very Rembrandtian kind of reddish, a dark reddish color near the side of the nose. And again, that color was very simple. Just add a little bit more cadmium red medium to the darker region of the palette, and there you go. And also a slight bit of alizarin permanent. Now I emphasize slight bit because it's not that much alizarin permanent. So here on the nostril, it has a tiny bit more alizarin permanent, and a tiny bit of ultramarine blue was added to that just to make sure that it wasn't too warm. And now we're going to just soften this edge directly beneath the nose, just so that it's a little bit less in focus than, say, the eyes. Now we're going to move on to our first still life element of this painting. Now another thing that I noticed is that this still life object appears much darker in the photo reference. The photo reference kind of just makes it overly dark, and there are actually some warmer colors within this little wood grain here. So this is a color very similar to that dark color you saw me apply to the side of the nostril. I think it's almost even the exact same color, to be honest. It's a very simple color, kind of like a cherry wood color you could get easily by mixing burnt umber, alizarin permanent, and cadmium red medium. So now there's going to be a little bit of a darker shape around here on the back side as one form overlaps another form right about there. And now we're going to put in some of the dark shape near the back of the still life object. And you can still see the transparency of the underpainting show through. And this is a really quick and simple way to create gradations of color by basically using the transparency of the paint and allowing the kind of the underpainting to kind of illuminate the so we're letting the light from the underpainting illuminate the color that we're placing through the transparency of the paint application. In order to achieve that, all you really need is a little bit more liquin on the brush, or whichever kind of painting medium you're using. So again, just Liquin original. And again, my favorite medium is not Liquin. My favorite medium is Neo McGilp, but I just haven't been able to, I ran out of it. I haven't been able to get another one, so I'm just sticking with the Liquin original for now, which is okay. It's just not my favorite. So just like that, very simple and easy, we have the effect of form on this still life object. All it takes is a few little value changes and letting the transparency of the underpainting show through, and just a little touch of light there. And we have basically just 1 minute left today, so I guess for the last thing we'll do is we're going to just push the dark shape a little bit here for this area of the still life. So again, I'm just using burnt umber and ultramarine blue and using a very semi-transparent application of oil paint. So again, this is going to be one of the last things I'll do. But before the video is over, I'm going to apply a few little final touches to the forehead. And I thought, since I'm trying to combine the art of realist painting with video, I'm going to do so in a very interesting cinematographic, if that's even the word, in a very interesting, I'm just going to film it in a very interesting way. How about that? Very similar to the beginning of this video. I hope you liked the little clips that I put of me traveling into the studio and shots of the studio. I really want to do more stuff like that. I really want to make this about the experience. I really want to bring the experience of being in the studio every single day. That being said, I really hope that this video helps you out. I'm really trying to bring the experience of painting to you. I wish you the best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you again very soon.